And this is our final talk, virtual lecture of the academic year here at the Max Kade Institute. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome our speaker this evening, Jesse David Chariton, who is a graduate student getting his PhD in history at Iowa State University. And his areas of specialization are German and Irish immigration through the lens of religion and voluntary associations. Jesse has a connection to Wisconsin, though, aside from the fact that Iowa is right next door. He did his undergraduate work in history and archaeological studies at UW La Crosse, University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. Then he went way down to Georgia, Columbus, Georgia, and he got his master's degree in history with a concentration in race, ethnicity, and society at Columbus State University. And the title of his talk this evening is Foreign Traditions and Fraternal Bonds, German-American Freemasons in the United States. Jesse, we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Before I start, I want to thank the Society for German American Studies, from whom I received an Albert Bernhard Faust Research Award, and the State Historical Society of Iowa, from whom I received a dissertation fellowship a couple years ago. During the 19th century, German-speaking immigrants to the United States joined and formed Masonic lodges as part of the immigration process, just as they founded church bodies, shooting clubs, and singing societies. This presentation will outline the transnational context of Freemasonry as a means of understanding the complex processes of Americanization. First, a note, this presentation will not include an exhaustive list of German lodges throughout American history, nor will it be about specific individuals who are members of such lodges, though both of these things would be very interesting. Investigating the activities of German-speaking lodges in America and their individual members in their broader contexts can provide insight into American civil society and Freemasonry, or at least the various Masonic organizations and their membership, can be a useful tool for historical research. Additionally, recognizing immigrants' backgrounds can facilitate better understanding of their experiences here in America. Beginning in the 1840s, American Freemasonry spread rapidly with westward expansion, and in many cases, immigrants to the United States established lodges to operate in their own languages. In the two cases I present here, we'll see that sometimes German Masons brought Old World Masonic traditions with them, as they did other traditions. And sometimes they could encounter resistance when trying to establish an ethnic lodge. First, a word about sources. Sources for researching Freemasonry and its members are readily available. I visited archives at the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison, as well as the Iowa Masonic Library in Cedar Rapids. There are many useful resources online, including a project by the George Washington National Masonic Memorial in Virginia, which is digitizing the proceedings of all Grand Lodges in the United States. Another useful resource is historic newspapers, many of which are readily available online. American Freemasonry, a fraternal organization with a set of rituals and ceremonies organized in a series of degrees, traces its tradition and heritage to the origins of Freemasonry in 18th century Britain. Since that time, it has become a worldwide fraternity with organizations at national, regional, and local levels. Local chapters are called lodges, and in the United States, state-level governing bodies are called Grand Lodges. American lodges are numbered, the number indicating the order in which the lodge received its dispensation or charter from the Grand Lodge. The organization is characterized by charity work and the use of stonemasons' tools and symbolism for moral improvement. Generally speaking, Freemasonry was founded when 4 lodges in London formed the Grand Lodge of England in 1717. With the publication of James Anderson's Constitutions in 1723, the Grand Lodge of England secured a hegemonic position in Freemasonry. The Grand Lodge of England came to dominate Freemasonry around the world as it chartered lodges throughout the British Empire. By the 1730s, Freemasons created lodges in British North America, most chartered by the Grand Lodge of England. Therefore, the origins of Grand Lodges in the United States can generally be traced to the Grand Lodge of England. From then on, the organization grew and blossomed into many distinct organizations, as seen here. Investigating the activities of German-speaking lodges in America and their individual members can provide insight into American civil society since, as one Masonic author observed, Freemasonry is a reflection of the society to which its members belong. Furthermore, Recognizing immigrants' backgrounds, especially German Masonic sociability, can facilitate a better understanding of immigrant experiences in America. After the anti-Masonic period of the 1820s and 1830s, during which lodges and Grand Lodges lost members, American Freemasons responded to a variety of cultural, social, and institutional changes. One major issue in mid-19th century American Freemasonry was the opposition of two different rites, or systems of rituals and degrees, the Scottish Rite and the York Rite. The York Rite was a tradition carried from England to the American colonies in the 1730s. Within the York Rite, there had been a schism in England, which left repercussions in America. The Scottish Rite, though officially founded in Charleston, South Carolina in 1801, had origins in mid-18th century France. These two rites fought over jurisdiction of geography and of rituals and degrees. Meanwhile, other organizations and rites, some semi-legitimate and some fabricated by degree peddlers, added to the confusion. One of these was adoptive Masonry, which allowed women to participate. Another was the French Rite, organized by the Grand Orient or Grand Lodge of France in 1786. By the 1730s, a decade after the founding of the Grand Lodge of England, Masonic lodges sprang up on the European continent. Beginning in the 1730s, France became the origin of a number of new Masonic rites. French Masons were partly influenced by a public oration by Andrew Michael Ramsay, an officer of the Grand Lodge of France, who proposed a chivalric origin for Freemasonry. Central to his theory was an assumed connection to monastic military orders, such as the Knights Templar. French Masons developed over 1,000 new degrees, organized in rites such as the Knights of the East, the Rite of Perfection, and the Chapter of Rose Croix. Because Germany had become the battleground for the conflict between the two Masonic systems, the Anglo-American and the French or Continental, it exhibited, that is, Germany exhibited the most luxuriant growth of deviations and offshoots of the Masonic order. German Masons built onto French foundations to develop the Chapter of Clermont, the Order of Strict Observance, and the rectified Scottish Rite, as well as the Illuminati and revised versions of Rosicrucians. Because of ongoing antagonism with the Roman Catholic Church, after the French Revolution, Masons in France developed rituals and ceremonies to replace those of the Church. One particular book, published in Strasbourg in 1826, includes rituals for Masonic baptism and confirmation for Masons' sons. Masonic baptism had an analog in Republican sponsorships, in which two adults would sponsor a child's entrance into the life of the French Republic. Similarly, when members of a Masonic lodge sponsored a child, the lodge offered the child instruction in the principles of Freemasonry and the protection and support of the lodge. If the child were male, he would essentially be pre-qualified for membership in the lodge upon reaching the appropriate age. Descriptions generally include the use of a ritual, a meal, and the adoption of children by the entire lodge or its officers. While Masonic adoption, or baptism, had its origins in Britain, adoptive Masonry, which allowed women to participate and was thus irregular according to English Freemasonry, was a continental development. Originating in the 1740s among the French aristocracy as a way for women to become actively involved with their husbands' lodges, eventually adoptive Masonry included not only Masons' wives, but also their sisters and daughters as well. Female participation in Freemasonry ran contrary to the Anglo-American Masonic tradition and was explicitly forbidden in Anderson's constitutions. The addition of women changed the organization, making it, quote, much more of a salon than a civic organization in the Anglo-American sense. Banquets and toasts apparently became just as important as were the symbolic rituals. By the 1770s, the Grand Orient of France officially recognized lodges of adoption, and by the end of the century, adoptive Masonry spread across the continent. During the following centuries, many innovations were made to Freemasonry, as Continental or Latin, French Freemasonry challenged Anglo-American Freemasonry in various ways. From its inception, British Freemasonry had allowed only male members, claiming a belief in a supreme being, and prescribed discussions of politics and religion during lodge meetings, requirements based on the ancient landmarks and reinforced in Anderson's constitutions. The contrary positions, the admission of women, the acceptance of atheists, and allowance of discussions of politics and religion, exhibit resistance to the British model by more liberal lodges of the continental system, eventually led by the Grand Orient of France. In response to the growing number of Masonic degrees and rites, the Grand Orient or Grand Lodge of France created the modern rite, or the French Rite, in 1786 as a way to simplify Masonry within its jurisdiction. By the 19th century, multiple rites and rituals were in use among German lodges, and some near the southwest border with France, the origin of some of the Concordia Lodge, which I'll mention briefly in a minute, their members used the French rite. The epicenter of Freemasonry in German-speaking Central Europe began in the Protestant North, but grew with the increased number of rites, and the situation in the late 18th century was one of, quote, complete confusion. Reform-minded Masons in Germany, such as Ignaz Aurelius Fessler and Friedrich Ludwig Schroeder, attempted to revise rituals and simplify the number of degrees authorized by their respective Grand Lodges. German Masonic practices of the early 19th century were particularly varied in form, and varied all the more because of overlapping geographic jurisdictions of multiple Grand Lodges in Central Europe. This was decades prior to German unification. But as historian Stefan Ludwig Hoffmann shows, German Masonic lodges were involved in all domains of their members' lives, and they functioned as a form of all-embracing sociability. Sons of Freemasons could petition for membership 5 years earlier than other men. Quite often, a son would join his father's lodge. German lodges celebrated feminine kinship through an annual social event for wives and daughters of Masons. These so-called sister celebrations furthered the members' own goals of sociability and alleviated the women's concerns about what went on during lodge functions. Not all German Masons appreciated this festivity, however, and in the 1850s, one German Grand Lodge issued a statement forbidding it, quote, for wise and easily comprehensible reasons, in language similar to that of the Grand Lodge of Wisconsin a decade later, as we will see. Beginning in the 1840s, after the anti-Masonic period, American Freemasonry spread rapidly with westward expansion as settlers established lodges on the ever-moving frontier. In many cases, immigrants to the United States established lodges to operate in their own languages, statewide Grand Lodges encouraging them to do so. San Francisco, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and New York hosted Italian, French, and German lodges. In New Orleans, lodges worked in German, Italian, French, and Spanish, and in the York, Scottish, and French rites. In the cases I will present here, the members of German language lodges were well integrated into the broader community in which they lived, and in many ways helped to build it. They also retained their ethnic identity and cultural values. Voluntary associations were central, especially to the development and maintenance of Midwestern communities in the 19th century. Kathleen Niels Conson explains in Immigrant Milwaukee that through their Vereinsleben, that is organizational or club life, immigrants could embrace their German culture while also participating in American life. For immigrants in the United States, Verein, including ethnic churches, fire companies, shooting and singing societies, and other social and cultural organizations, provided a sense of community based on a mutual background and rituals, and a similar value system. Immigrants' participation in these groups was not merely a way to deal with their new situation in the United States, or with dealing with some trauma of immigrating. Rather, the Verein of German immigrants continued the organizational life that had been central to German society in Europe. Moreover, just as voluntary organizations like the Masonic Lodge or the Turnverein were central to building the broader community, they also served as cultural and social centers of the ethnic community itself. During the 1850s, the Grand Lodge of Wisconsin issued charters to a number of German language lodges formed by members of the growing immigrant population within its jurisdiction. These include Aurora Lodge number 30 in Milwaukee, Concordia Lodge number 83 in Madison, and Astria Lodge number 104 in Port Washington. A group of German-speaking Masons from Kentucky had formed another, though short-lived, German-speaking lodge in Superior, Wisconsin in 1856. The charter process for that lodge was never completed because, according to one source, the members were Southern sympathizers, and the Grand Master returned their petition. The influence of the growing population of German immigrants in Wisconsin can also be seen in the 1860 vote of Sheboygan Lodge number 11, which had been established in 1846 by Masons from New England, to now conduct 2 meetings per month in German. Part of the British heritage of Freemasonry is an opposition to innovations. Successive Wisconsin Grand Masters emphasized in their annual addresses to the Grand Lodge the importance of adhering to the landmarks and traditions of Freemasonry. Particularly important in the case of Concordia Lodge is the concept of regularity. If a lodge or Grand Lodge acted out of the ordinary, by admitting women, for example, other lodges would consider it irregular. This occasionally became an issue throughout the United States, including at Wisconsin Grand Lodge annual meetings. Since German immigrants to Wisconsin were the largest ethnic group to migrate there and are particularly heterogeneous, it is not surprising that they brought with them a variety of cultural traditions, including different versions of Freemasonry. This was the case with Concordia Lodge number 83 in Madison, Wisconsin. When officers of the Grand Lodge of Wisconsin sanctioned Concordia Lodge for conducting a strange ceremony on a Sunday afternoon, the members of Concordia claimed that it was a regular practice in European lodges. After a brief look at the membership of Concordia Lodge, I will, this presentation will take a glimpse into the European background with which they were familiar. The Grand Lodge of Wisconsin, founded in 1844, was fully prepared to accommodate German members, but not German members from a different Masonic tradition. German-speaking immigrants who settled in Madison in the early 1850s quickly established a close-knit community by setting up businesses and actively participating in a variety of local social, political, and religious groups. Soon after John George Ott, a native of Switzerland, arrived in Madison in 1850, he built a house and set up a brick kiln. Samuel Klauber, born in Bohemia, arrived in Madison the following year, after having spent time in New York, and opened a dry goods store. Klauber and Ott were part of a neighborhood of German-speaking shopkeepers, merchants, and craftsmen located east of downtown and the Capitol building in an area known as Third Lake Ridge. The largest and most culturally significant immigrant group, Madison's German immigrants ran businesses and worked in ways that supported the city's early economic development. Within 5 years, this German community established a Männerchor and a Turnverein, as well as Madison Fire Engine Company No. 2. These early ethnic organizations would be of great benefit for immigrants arriving in later decades. But their community involvement was not restricted to German organizations. As in the larger city of Milwaukee, while Madison's German Americans formed and participated in traditionally German groups, they also actively participated in a variety of other local clubs and societies, like the Oddfellows and the Freemasons. For example, John G. Ott and Samuel Klauber each served as officers of Madison Lodge No. 5. German Americans were also involved in the 1854 founding of Hiram Lodge No. 50. Most of Madison's Germans were Democrats and actively participated in local Democratic clubs, though a few, including Samuel Klauber and Dominic Castreiter, were Republicans. Some served in elected or appointed public office. The German-American Freemasons in mid-19th century Madison lived within a wide range of occupational and economic status, reflecting the situation in German Masonic lodges. Back in Germany, that is. Madison's German Masons were also active in churches and religious organizations. Their example stands in opposition to those who have postulated that immigrants sought in the lodge a substitute for the religion they may have left behind. It also blurs the lines between Vereinsdeutsche and Kirchensdeutsche, or club Germans and church Germans. In March 1856, 17 German families, including those of Marcus Kohner, Simon Seckels, and Samuel Klauber, formed a Jewish congregation in Madison. After they incorporated as the Gates of Heaven Synagogue in 1859, they met in Klauber's home until they built a new building in 1862, which was designed by August Kutzbach, architect of Wisconsin's second Capitol building and a member of Hiram Lodge. In 1857, German Catholics in Madison split from St. Raphael's Parish to form Holy Redeemer. Among the supporters of Holy Redeemer was Hiram Lodge member Caspar Meyer, a native of Baden who ran a restaurant in Madison. While German-speaking Catholics and Jews could sometimes become isolated from other German-speaking immigrants, in Freemasonry they saw opportunities for broader association. Because of the community involvement of its members, Concordia Lodge was not as isolated as some other ethnic lodges in the United States. In the spring of 1857, Seckels, Kohner, Meyer, and Ott, with about a dozen other men, mostly members of Madison Lodge No. 5 and Hiram Lodge No. 50, petitioned the Grand Lodge of Wisconsin for a charter. Grandmaster Henry S. Baird granted a dispensation in March for them to meet as Concordia Lodge and to use the German language for their meetings. When they received their charter as Concordia Lodge No. 83 in June, they became one of about 85 lodges under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of Wisconsin. Concordia Lodge regularly cooperated with other lodges in Madison, and its officers attended Grand Lodge meetings. Of course, German American Masons' linguistic and cultural separation from their Grand Lodge could allow for inconsistencies to creep in. For example, District Deputy Grand Master Orlando Foster expressed the difficulty he experienced during his 1856 visit to Aurora Lodge in Milwaukee. Quote, "This lodge is composed wholly of Germans, doing their work in the German language, with which I am unacquainted, and could not judge as to the letter of their work." He attempted to give them instruction, but could not judge of their accuracy. Wisconsin Grand Lodge officers attempted to prevent similar situations by requiring German language lodges to keep records in English as well as in German. They went a step further by creating a second Grand Lecturer position, one to work specifically with German language lodges. In American Grand Lodges, the Grand Lecturer was a Grand Lodge officer whose responsibilities included overseeing ritual matters, discipline, and jurisprudence within subordinate lodges. In 1858, a committee which included Concordia member Marcus Kohner and Astoria Lodge member William A. Pors, recommended adding the position of German lecturer, who, quote, "shall have the same rights and powers and shall have the same duties to perform as the Grand Lecturer." In 1859, Dominic Hastreiter, Worshipful Master of Concordia, served in that role, although, as we see on this slide, the German lecturer didn't get paid. Nevertheless, what happened later that year was not a matter of language, as in the case of Aurora Lodge. No, Concordia produced something wholly unusual from the perspective of Wisconsin Freemasons. On a Sunday afternoon in 1859, the members of Concordia Lodge held a special meeting with their wives and children present. The lodge officers opened what they called a Sisters' Lodge, and, after a ceremony peculiar to themselves, proceeded to baptize the male children present. Now, I won't detail it here, but this does not necessarily resemble typical baptism as might be seen in various traditions of Christianity. Nevertheless, the Grand Master Luther Tracy expressed shock after hearing of the event and sent the Grand Lecturer to investigate. The event was considered irregular because it had taken place on a Sunday, included women, and had the trappings of a religious ceremony. The Grand Officers found that not only did the incident take place, but the officers of Concordia Lodge claimed that baptism was the normal practice among Masonic lodges in Germany. Tracy, figuring that, quote, "the continuance of the practice in this jurisdiction would lay us open to the criticism of the world," suspended the charter of Concordia Lodge and ordered them to explain themselves at the next annual meeting of the Grand Lodge. However, in December, the officers of Concordia petitioned to be reinstated, promising in that event to conform to the requirements of the Constitution of the Grand Lodge of Wisconsin. But they held their position that, quote, "as Masonry was the same in all countries, they had the right to practice it in this jurisdiction." In February 1860, Tracy sent Deputy Grand Master Amasa Cobb to act on his behalf. Cobb conducted interviews with the members of Concordia and other Masons in Madison who had some knowledge of the circumstances, likely German-speaking Masons in other Madison lodges. Cobb soon realized the ideological and cultural differences at play, writing that he considered Concordia's actions to be, quote, "errors of the head and not of the heart." At a meeting the next month, Cobb instructed the officers and other members of Concordia that such things as Masonic baptism and sisters' lodges are unknown to Freemasonry, as recognized and practiced in and under the authority of the Grand Lodges of the United States of America, most certainly not attempted and practiced by the Grand Lodge of Wisconsin. He also lectured them upon the principles of Freemasonry as recognized by the Grand Lodges of the United States. The officers and members of Concordia Lodge then agreed to yield a ready and willing obedience to the Grand Lodge and its Grand Officers in all things appertaining to Freemasonry, and more particularly to this, quote, "that no lodge as such can appear in public or perform any Masonic ceremony in the presence of persons not Masons." Cobb then reinstated their charter. Rather than cause a scandal, when threatened with a revocation of their charter and a permanent closure by the Grand Lodge, the members of Concordia decided to conform to the standards of Wisconsin Freemasonry and to confer no more baptisms. Trying to navigate the complicated 19th century American Masonic landscape and trying to keep their subordinate lodge in order, the officers of the Grand Lodge of Wisconsin acted in accordance with Masonic tradition as they understood it. The Grand Lodge of Wisconsin's German lecturer was to, quote, "fully understand the work of ancient York Masonry," that is, the York Rite, in the German language, end quote. But Concordia Lodge worked in the French Rite. Astoria Lodge in Port Washington like most other German language lodges in the US, indeed most lodges of any sort in America, worked in the York Rite ritual. Aurora Lodge in Milwaukee used a modified version of the French Rite, and this was likely the case with Concordia, since the proceedings of the Grand Lodge at that time of Concordia's founding refer to necessary alterations in the bylaws, having been completed before the lodge received its charter. In the mid-19th century, the Scottish Rite was spreading in the US, but the French Rite was still generally unknown to American Freemasons. As District Deputy Foster wrote regarding his visit to Aurora Lodge in 1856, quote, "It seemed to me that the form of their work bears little resemblance to ancient York Masonry." Though not necessarily a part of the French Rite, Masonic baptism, a practice alien to English-speaking Masons, would, like the French Rite, nonetheless have been known to Masons in or from continental Europe. It is not quite clear whether Concordia's baptism ceremony was related to their use of the French Rite rituals or simply German Masonic sociability. Later in the century, other lodges conferred Masonic baptisms. For example, Germania Lodge number 46 in New Orleans, as we see here. But these were adopted from the Scottish Rite and a different, rewritten baptism ritual. That in itself is a complicated story and out of the scope of this presentation. In fact, Germania Lodge was chartered in 1844 as a York Rite Lodge, so Concordia's version is totally different. The German-speaking members of Concordia Lodge came from a different tradition of Freemasonry than their American-born neighbors and many other German-born neighbors. They brought a version of Freemasonry as it was practiced in Germany, and their lodge membership connected this otherwise diverse group of individuals. They surrendered their charter in 1882, and according to one report, the Grand Lodge of Wisconsin intended to end the use of the French Rite by 1886. A group of German immigrant Masons in Davenport didn't have quite the same experience, however. In 1867, a group of Master Masons in good standing in Davenport, this is Davenport, Iowa, Lodge number 37, petitioned the Grand Lodge of Iowa for permission to form another Masonic lodge in Davenport, one that would conduct its business in German. The initial denial of their request by Grand Master Campbell Peck of Keokuk, Iowa, says as much about demographic trends in Iowa at the time as about American westward expansion. Like its counterpart in Wisconsin, the Grand Lodge of Iowa dates to 1844, founded by 4 lodges which had been chartered by the Grand Lodge of Missouri. During the 1850s, Masonry flourished in Iowa, reflecting the young state's development. In 1851, the Grand Lodge of Iowa granted a dispensation to 12 new lodges, including Davenport Lodge number 37. Early residents of Davenport believed the city would become a place of commercial importance because of its position on the Mississippi River. That Masons in Davenport were desirous of a German language lodge indicates the strength of the immigrant community there. It also reflects the nationwide trend I mentioned earlier. Indeed, German speakers constituted the largest immigrant group to settle Iowa. Davenport attracted German-speaking immigrants from its early period. For example, a family from Württemberg settled near the village of Davenport within weeks of its founding in 1836. Many German immigrants had previously spent time in another important river city, Cincinnati, Ohio. Because of its location on the Mississippi River, Davenport developed quickly, becoming by the 1850s the boomtown of eastern Iowa. More than that, Davenport became a predominantly German city during the antebellum era. While most German-speaking immigrants to Iowa settled on farms, Davenport and other river cities attracted a number of German-speaking professionals, business owners, and artisans who provided a boost to the local economy. Many of Davenport's entrepreneurs and professionals had been involved in, indeed leaders of, the 1848 European revolutions. Most of the German speakers to settle in Davenport were from Schleswig-Holstein. One historian referred to Davenport as, quote, the most German city in the entire West, politically and socially. An immigrant from Mecklenburg wrote in an 1851 letter that one hardly recognizes that one is in America because one hears German everywhere. Iowa Freemasonry expanded most rapidly in the period in the 1850s. In 1854 alone, 21 new lodges were established, including Tuscan Lodge number 57, a second lodge in Davenport. Despite the presence of the nativist know-nothings, stronger in Davenport than in Madison, Wisconsin, German immigrants in Davenport created and established the familiar singing societies, Turnverein, and other social groups which would soon characterize German America. Led by Christian Mueller, a native of Kiel, Germans in Davenport founded the Davenport Turner Society in 1852. German Congregationalists started their church in 1854, and German Catholics began St. Kunigunde Parish in 1856. Around the same time, German-speaking residents built Holyborns Hall and Larmans Hall for musical and theatrical performances. And in 1861, German-speaking Jews formed B'nai Israel Congregation. By 1867, Davenport residents numbered nearly 25,000. When the 14th Street Methodist Episcopal Church built a new building to accommodate its growth, Reverend A.B. Kendig invited the Grand Lodge of Iowa to lay the cornerstone. This is a common practice for new public buildings. Kendig was also appointed that year to the position of Grand Orator of the Grand Lodge. In June 1867, Grand Master Reuben Mickle laid the cornerstone, and Grand Secretary Theodore S. Parvin gave an address on the relation of Masonry to the Bible. Earlier that year, at the recommendation of members of Davenport Lodge number 37, Grand Master Peck issued a dispensation for a new lodge in Davenport, Trinity Lodge number 208. In 1867, Davenport Lodge number 37 had 139 members. They had added 36 just that year. And there were about 200 lodges operating within the state of Iowa. Apparently, with Grandmaster Peck's acceptance of Trinity Lodge, the members of Davenport Lodge thought it not unreasonable to start a new lodge for their many German-speaking neighbors. It's interesting, in this situation, it was a different lodge in town petitioning, whereas in Madison, it was the members of Concordia themselves that tried to start a new lodge. In January 1867, Charles S. Streeper of Davenport Lodge number 37 sent a letter to Grandmaster Peck asking for guidance. Streeper was acting as chairman of the Committee on Transcripts of Lodges under dispensation, the committee which usually would make suggestions for the Grandmaster. But in this case, the committee members were at a loss as to how to proceed, since there was no precedent for a lodge in Iowa to work in a non-English language. Peck denied the request for a dispensation because he thought it would unnecessarily isolate the Germans in Davenport, that Grand Lodge officers would, quote, have no oversight over their ritual and work, because not understanding it, and therefore could not control it, end quote. Perhaps Peck had heard of the refusal of the Grand Master of Minnesota to grant a dispensation to a German language lodge in his territory a few years earlier. Wisconsin had also had an incident that I mentioned before of a German language lodge being disallowed by the Grand Lodge. Perhaps Peck was simply too busy and found it expedient to leave the matter up to his successor. Campbell Peck was at the time a partner in the dominant Indian trading firm of the Upper Missouri, and may even have been out of the state when he responded to the request. In the interest of time, I'll skip the many details there. Either way, Peck forwarded the request to the Grand Lodge, quote, for consideration and such action or recommendation to the incoming Grand Master as you may deem expedient. Peck claimed that the two lodges already existing in Davenport were enough, and that the Grand Lodge of Iowa would have no direct oversight or control over the work of a German language lodge because of the language difference. This in a way echoes the concern of Orlando Foster a decade earlier in Wisconsin. 2 months later, in August 1867, Peck's successor, Grand Master Reuben Mickle, granted a dispensation for the new lodge in Davenport. And at the next session, that is 1868, the lodge received its charter as Fraternal Lodge number 221. Trinity Lodge number 208 and Fraternal Lodge number 221, therefore, each received their charters at the 1868 session of the Grand Lodge, held in Des Moines. Grand Master Reuben Mickle, himself the child of German-speaking immigrants, was not necessarily more open to the idea of a German lodge in Davenport. In fact, he later suggested that had he been consulted beforehand, he, quote, might and probably should have discouraged it, in part because, as Peck had suggested, the two lodges in Davenport could have been enough for the Masons there. But he had been a fill-in for Peck and was more familiar with the situation in Davenport. He had served in the Grand Lodge for a few years prior to this, and as deputy master under Peck, he had presided at some meetings of the Grand Lodge in Peck's absence. He was also likely more aware of the broader trend of allowing lodges to meet in languages other than English. Just the previous year, Grandmaster Whitehead of New Jersey had accepted the petition of a German language lodge there. With perhaps a bit of discernment, however, Mickle suggested and recommended that Fraternal Lodge be required to keep their records in English as well as in German. Again, this reminds us of the Wisconsin Grand Lodge officers who a decade earlier had made the same decision. Soon after Mickle approved the dispensation for Fraternal Lodge, not a very creative name, all three lodges were thriving. Mickle himself attended the initiation of officers of Fraternal Lodge number 221 in June 1868. Thereafter, Fraternal Lodge met on the first Thursday of the month and had about 50 members. Noting the number of lodges in Iowa by this time, delegates to the 1868 Grand Lodge meeting discussed the possibility of constructing a permanent building for the use of the Grand Lodge, for meetings and for record and library storage. The result is that the Iowa Masonic Library is among the largest in the world and was the first Masonic library to have its own building. And like I mentioned at the start, that's the one that I visited to go look at the archives. By the end of the 19th century, and especially with World War I, many German language Masonic lodges had either stopped using German or totally closed up. This, as with many other instances where German language usage ended, was either voluntary or by force, as can be seen in this newspaper headline from Illinois. However, some German lodges survived, and some continue operating into the 21st century, proudly celebrating their ethnic heritage. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, David, for your Jesse, for your presentation. We can open things up now to questions. If you want to put your questions into the Q&A for Jesse, I will read them out and we can have a discussion time. And we have one question, the first question that came in here for you, Jesse, from Milan Pohonch. How many German lodges are left in the United States?
That I don't have an answer for. Like I said at the outset, this wasn't really meant to be a survey of all of them. I know of the one Aurora Lodge in Milwaukee. I believe Germania Lodge in New Orleans is still operating, and there's one in Maryland, I believe. But there may be more. And there have been some that started later. For example, the one in Maryland that I just mentioned, it just started in 1870s, whereas some of these were from an earlier period. So
there's a question coming from me. I was intrigued by this reference. I'd never heard of this before, of Masonic baptisms. Is
yes.
that maybe I missed it, but is it associated with one of the particular rites, like the French or the ancient York, or and is it something that's kind of widespread, or was it exceptional? You mentioned that there was a connection with, it was familiar to German Freemasons that came over here. Can you say a little bit more about that and maybe its status today too?
Yeah. So as I hinted at earlier, after the French Revolution, there was a spurt of recreating religious type institutions and traditions. So they had confirmation and baptism ceremonies for people entering the Republic rather than the Catholic Church. And those spread. And at the time, it's also like coincidental that Freemasonry was blossoming. As I mentioned at one point, like in France, there were 1,000 different Masonic degrees and different structures. So it was part of that and kind of combined together, such that by the late 1700s, there's a French document that I did not mention that lays out actual Masonic baptism. That was used again in the 1850s by a man named Albert Pike, who's pretty influential for American Freemasonry and Masonry worldwide, kind of helped to continue the development of the so-called Scottish Rite, so that by the later 19th century, that version of Masonic baptism was done more than a few times in American Scottish Rite lodges, but that's after the Civil War. In the period prior to that, that's what's kind of unique about Concordia Lodge in Madison, is that, and there's actually a French lodge in New Orleans that did a baptism the same 1859 as well. That is directly from Europe, and that's a European thing that they would have been familiar with. But as I indicated, it's not totally clear. I still have some of the archival stuff I'm looking at. Not totally clear whether Concordia doing the Masonic baptism was because they were part of the French Rite or because of their German Masonic sociability. They just wanted to have wives and kids with them on a Sunday. What's wrong with that? So that was not typical in Wisconsin otherwise. So
Interesting. Very interesting. So we've got a few more questions here. Very quick question from Marianne Miracle. Were there any lodges in Los Angeles or Cleveland?
again, I can't speak to specifics like that. I do think, well, maybe not Los Angeles. San Francisco had multiple different ethnic lodges, and not just German, but Italian and Spanish and others. I don't know about LA or Cleveland.
Hey, and this is observation and a question by Yogi Repman. It's on the second to last slide. He saw the name of M. Matthias Rolfes, a famous 1848er from Schleswig-Holstein and a politician. Do you know how Mr. Rolfes became a member of the Davenport Lodge, by any chance?
You said second to last slide?
Yeah, that's what, maybe farther back, but it was in the context of the Davenport.
I have a membership list. I don't know. Can you repeat the question?
So yeah, he says on a slide that there was the name M. Rolfes, Rolfes, and he thinks he identifies it as Matthias, but it's M. Rolfes, who was a famous 1848er from Schleswig-Holstein and a politician.
Yeah, I haven't looked into the individuals, the people in Davenport as much as I have in Madison. And actually, I've got his book on my Repman's book on my shelf. So some of the 48ers were heavily involved in Freemasonry and other such things. Some were not. And again, I'm kind of stuck in Madison. That's the part of the peculiarity of Madison, has the Catholics and Jewish members also, which would not, the guys in Madison were not 48ers as much. So
here's a comment from Gary Davis on another German-speaking lodge. He believes that there still may be a German-speaking lodge in Washington, D.C. called the Arminius Loge. He believes that's the name. So that's connecting it here. So I guess the next one would be from Cy Kryline. Have you researched German lodges in southeastern Pennsylvania by any chance?
No. Philadelphia had at least one German lodge, but that's all I know.
Okay.
So, sorry.
We've got a comment here. It doesn't look like a question, but it's information here from Nancy Purchase. Member of Hiram Lodge 144, free and accepted Masons and a past high priest of Fulton Chapter 167. Royal Arch Masons, doesn't give a name here, but it refers to it. He was a past illustrious master of Fulton Council 50 Cryptic Masons and a past commander and recorder for 20 years of Lake Ontario Commandery 32 Knights Templar. Not sure who that refers to. But this member of a Hiram Lodge 144, does that ring any bells for you?
Nope.
Okay. So then we have a comment here from Tobias. There are at least two German lodges in Pennsylvania, the Hermann Humboldt Lodge in Philadelphia and the Teutonia in Reading. Interesting.
The Hermann Humboldt is on the screen currently.
Aha, there we go. There we go. Okay. Yes, and in fact, Michael Hodges says the Hermann Humboldt Lodge number 125, still in existence since 1811. He happens to be the worshipful master. Oh, welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here. That's great. Yep. And then Tobias also chimes in that the Hermann Humboldt was chartered in 1811. Here's an interesting question from Eddie Walsh. He's curious if the Freemasons influenced the sons of Hermann, the Hermann sons, right? When the Hermann sons, the sons of Hermann, that fraternal organization, or the benevolent organization, was established in the 1850s in the United States. Any connections there?
I would not be surprised, but I can't speak to that specifically. Yeah, I don't know.
Interesting.
That would be an interesting bit of research.
Yeah. So Michael Hodges kind of chimes in about the DC Lodge, which was referred to as the Arminius Lodge. He said it was closed down. And in parentheses, he indicates that the warrant was pulled by their Grand Lodge. So it sounds like there's a story there. And then Tobias also joins in, says that I recently heard that Arminios 25 in DC has lost its charter. So um, here's a question from Linda Schmieder-Wopperer, which is, do you know anything about the Schlaraffia groups? They're still active worldwide and do speak German at their meetings. I know that there's one in Milwaukee.
Nope.
Schlaraffia? No.
No.
Question from Reed Smucker.
Mark, did you say there's one in Milwaukee?
There's Schlaraffia groups, at least represented at Milwaukee's German Fest,
Okay.
or at least one group there. So yes. Reed Smucker asks, did you encounter atheism apparent with German lodges?
No, not the ones that I've looked at, the ones that end up in America. And that would have been frowned upon in America anyway, as much, if not more, than the baptism.
Interesting. Yeah, it'd be interesting to kind of see to what extent there was sort of parallel tracks of free thinkers
Mhm.
and Freemasons. It's interesting. Question from Ann Bridges. This is a general question about Freemasonry. Have Catholics commonly participated in Freemasonry throughout history? Bet that's a tricky question to address.
It is a tricky question. If that's the simple question, the simple answer is yes. So, from an early point, the Roman Catholic Church forbade Freemasonry or forbade its members of being Masons, but not the other direction. So, Masonic lodges don't mind having Catholics.
I think that's still true today, isn't it? That technically the Catholic Church
I believe so, yeah.
doesn't endorse that. Yeah. So Chris Ost Morales says that there were two lodges in Philadelphia, that his father was or is a member of the Hermann Loge 125 when he was a child in 1976, and it merged with the Humboldt Loge.
Oh.
So at some point there were the Hermann Loge and the Humboldt. That explains the hyphenation there. Linda, who had that question about the Schlaraffia group, mentions that in Buffalo, New York, there's a German-speaking Schlaraffia group. And Yogi Repman, a couple of things. He had said it was the third to last slide. He thinks that there was that reference to Rolfes. We can maybe find that. Is it on there? No, I'm not seeing it. Unless he's got really, really good vision and he could see it among the, the 30 guys on that poster. I'm not sure there. And Yogi also actually has a comment here saying that he attended a Schlaraffia German meeting in Milwaukee back in 1989. More information on the Hermann and Humboldt Loge in Philadelphia that was merged in December 2001. So thank you, Michael, for that. So yeah. We still have some time for more questions or comments if people would like to enter them into the chat. Often with podcasts, when there's like bonus material, there's the question is posed to the speaker or panelists. Is there anything else that you would like to share that you didn't address?
I do have a couple of things, and I hesitated to do this earlier.
Let's go for it.
So I mentioned later in the 19th century, there was a series of Masonic baptisms based on things written by this guy, Albert Pike. And you can see the screen still, right?
Yep, absolutely.
So he had based his work, you can see his ceremonial on the bottom right, that's the title page. He had based his on a French document from the late 18th century. And basically rewrote it for an American audience, and then performed it, and I use that term on purpose, in New York and other places around the country, and that kind of spread. And then it died down by 1900. Here it is again in the book of the Scottish Rite by a guy named McClenahan. Recently, I guess in the last decade or so, there's been kind of an attempted resurgence of a Masonic baptism, which kind of parallels a new membership boost or something in American Freemasonry. I don't know how far that went or if it's related to this particular version by Albert Pike or not. But yeah.
Very interesting. Interesting. This is probably a very big question, so you can keep it brief. But Marianne asks, what requirements were required to were necessary to join? Maybe just kind of like is there sort of a general
Yeah,
kind of description?
yeah. So of the so-called like Anglo-American lodges, those stemming out of England and then mainstream America, one had to be male of an appropriate age, whether it's 18 or 21 or whatever, um, and have a belief in God. Um, and part of the logic for that was there was an oath on a Bible and things. So, but what happened in France is they allowed women at first in women only organizations, but then they kind of merged and subsumed them, so that now there are totally co-ed Masonic organizations. And then in France in the 1870s, France got rid of a requirement to use any kind of sacred scripture on the altar in the lodge room. So they've totally like divorced from Anglo-American Freemasonry worldwide. So there are places, for example, South America, Mexico, Philippines, that have some of this French or Continental influence, but there are many others, the former British Empire, India, um, and America, that are the Anglo-American version. So, and it's not quite that simple with the York versus Scottish Rite versus French Rite, but it's the tip of the iceberg.
We've got another comment here. This is coming from Gary Davis, mentioning that the Aurora Loge in Milwaukee meets at 517 East Beaumont Avenue in Whitefish Bay, Wisconsin, which is part of Milwaukee, if anyone is interested. So, yeah, thanks for the information there, Gary. And here's a question for me. Live here in Madison, and I was driving by a building that was kind of interesting, and I slowed down. I saw that it said Prince Hall Lodge, and then I was curious what that meant, and I looked it up, and it's a very old African American group of lodges. To what extent was there any kind of welcoming or maybe barriers to folks of African descent in um, maybe lodges generally in North America? But is there any question about sort of ethnic or racial diversity in the German lodges that you've come across in your research?
Yeah, that's a you went to the second layer of that question pretty quick. So the Prince Hall lodges, as I said at some point, most lodges in America trace their descent to the Grand Lodge of England, some to Grand Lodge of Ireland or Scotland. Um, by the time of the Revolution, in fact, just before the American Revolution, there was a group of free black men who, I forget if they were in Boston or Philadelphia somewhere, who petitioned one of the Grand Lodge of Ireland, I think, to get a charter and have their own lodge, which they did and they succeeded. After the American Revolution, American Freemasons didn't really recognize that. So ever since then, into the late 20th century, there's been a parallel organization such that so-called Prince Hall Freemasons, which are traditionally black, have their own Grand Lodges in the same geographic jurisdiction as so-called mainstream lodges. By the late 20th century, most states' Grand Lodges and Prince Hall Grand Lodges have recognized each other, and they have meals together and that sort of thing. Prince Hall has a strong tradition, and they're very proud of that longstanding tradition. What's really interesting is Masonry claims a universalism, and this stems back to its Enlightenment origins. And there's a guy, Andreas Ernefers, who's a European scholar of mostly of European Masonry, among other things, who's recently come across a cache of documents in New York of a German language lodge there. And he's been looking at the paradox between if Masonry is universal, how did these German Americans feel about native-born Americans not being very kind to their black neighbors and not allowing them in lodges and that sort of thing. So I haven't looked into that much, but it is a very interesting question.
That's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. All right. Well, that covers all the questions that we've had. Thanks everybody for your questions and comments here, information that you shared. I learned a lot, Jesse, from your presentation this evening too. It's really gotten a lot of wheels spinning. This is a topic that is not one that we've addressed at the Max Kade Institute in the past. And so I'm really excited to have you join us this evening and share some of your work. Is your dissertation actually, do you have a section in your dissertation that's going to be addressing Freemasonry specifically, or is this something that's kind of separate from your
It,
dissertation?
not specifically as such, but it will fit in. My dissertation will be actually Madison, Wisconsin, in the antebellum period. So I'll be looking at this Concordia Lodge and the other things that those same members had to do with. So
Interesting. Wonderful. Well, thanks again, Jesse, for joining us. We really, it's good to see you virtually, and I'm very grateful to all of our attendees who've joined us this evening, and you're on our list, and so we will keep you apprised of events in the future. But thanks so much for your support of the Max Kade Institute for German American Studies by attending this evening. And thanks again, Jesse, for coming and sharing.
thank you very much.
You bet.